Started. All right, y'all. We're gonna wait a few minutes for a couple of folks to hop on here, and then we'll get started shortly. Mark, can I hear you loud and clear, man?
Test, test, test. Hey,
All right. Let's see here. Check something real quick. We got about a good amount of participants. All right, my friend. I am gonna get us rolling, Mark. You ready to get started on this bad boy?
thumbs up.
All right, everyone. Well, we want to welcome y'all to new hunt class this week. Uh, this week we're talking public land elk hunting, and we're going to be talking about e-scouting. We've got Mr. Mark Kayser on here. We got myself, Will Cooper. For some of y'all that know me or listen to HuntStand's Make Your Mark podcast, I host that bad boy over there, and we're going to get into it a little bit. But just a little bit about myself. You can see, got myself my first elk there this past year in Colorado, an over-the-counter tag. And so what we're going to be doing today with Mark, we are going to be diving into everything e-scouting for elk and just really getting into it. And so, couple things for tonight before we get into the nitty-gritty of it. We are going to have a Q&A chat room that a lot of y'all can ask questions. We've got Josh Dalkey on the backside of it that he's going to be monitoring stuff. So that way y'all have some questions. We can answer those at the end. We do have a lot of y'all that we've already got some questions curated when you signed up for this hunt class tonight. So we will have a chance for y'all to get those answered at the end. And in addition to that, three lucky winners are going to be winning a pretty sick prize package later tonight. So we'll get into that. And we're going to get rolling with Mark. But before we do, for those of y'all that know HuntStand, you know what it's capable of. Many of y'all probably signed up for HuntStand Pro or Pro Whitetail because a lot of y'all on tonight's hunt class, some of y'all might be those Eastern whitetail hunters, Midwest guys that like to go out west every once in a while. So you might have this already. But for those that aren't familiar with HuntStand, we are the number one hunting and land management app. And if you get the pro tier of HuntStand, there's lots of features in there that you can take out west. We've got monthly satellite imagery, we've got 3D maps, we've got a ton of tools that not only just apply to the whitetail hunter, but to the Western guy as well. So I'm going to let Mark show us how he likes to use HuntStand. We're getting into that tonight for e-scouting and everything. And so without further ado, we've got our guy Mark Kayser on here. For those of y'all that don't know Mark, he is a HuntStand Pro contributor, writes a lot for us, does a lot for us, a lot of video content. He's a writer, author, content creator, an avid Western hunter. And so, without further ado, Mr. Mark, I'm gonna let you take it, man.
Thanks, Will. And I appreciate everybody who's tuned in tonight. I know everybody has busy lifestyles, and it means a lot to me that you've actually signed up, registered, want to be part of this. So if we can get your questions answered at the end or file them in while we're doing this, please, by all means, do so. My name is Mark Kayser. I make my living as a writer, but I'm a die-hard hunter. I do go on some guided hunts, but for elk, I've just really dove in big time to the DIY public land elk hunting type adventure. And I grew up in South Dakota, next door to where I live now. I live in Wyoming. I live in north central Wyoming. And in South Dakota, you just couldn't get elk tags. And I really had this desire to hunt elk because my family, when I was younger, owned some land in the Black Hills and we would see elk. But in South Dakota, you draw one like every 15 years, maybe if you were lucky. And I did kill a couple elk in South Dakota and have been hunting elk my entire adult life. But to really take a bite out of elk hunting, I moved one state to the west and landed in Wyoming. and I haven't hit the brakes yet on elk hunting. Although parts of my body are telling me, maybe you might want to pump the brakes a little bit. But so that's a little bit about me. I love elk hunting. I try to go on a couple hunts every year, depending on what tag I can draw. And we're going to talk about that game, the elk tag game here. But usually I'm in the elk woods, elk country, from about September 1st through Halloween, off and on. Sometimes almost straight. It gets to be a lot of time in the mountains, but I do love elk hunting, and it does take that time to kill an elk. So with that, let's go to the next slide here. So to understand scouting for elk, you have to understand elk. And elk are different than whitetails in some respects, not all, but in some. One thing that elk and whitetails have in common that mule deer and pronghorn do not have is elk are very adaptable, and they can live in prairie or forest habitat. Now, if you go back in history, elk at one time went from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and many of you know that. Some of you maybe are from the east of the Mississippi and understand that there's elk out there. And they went from the tundra, the Arctic Circle, practically all the way into the jungles of South America. So elk are very adaptable. And again, whitetails are too. So they have that in common. But elk has seasonal patterns, and they have broad, big seasonal patterns where whitetails tend to shift a little bit, maybe get out of their homeland because they need winter cover, winter food. Elk will actually travel miles, 20, 30, 40, 50 miles. Now, prairie elk maybe won't have to do that as much, but mountain elk will actually migrate and shift a whole homeland territory type area from winter to summer, back and forth. So elk are not browsers like whitetail and moose. Elk are grazers. It's another huge difference. And you need to remember that, because when you're scouting, when you're e-scouting or boots on the ground, look for places where elk are going to eat, because they're going to need grass. They will browse a little bit on certain species. Most part, they're just like a big cow. And those cows require a lot of water. Now, during some parts of the year, just like deer, they can get some of that hydration from eating. But elk country is a little drier than whitetail country. So they're seeking out water all the time. And right now, at this time of the year, like in my backyard, it's super dry. They're getting nothing out of the grazing that they're putting into their body for moisture. So they're having to find springs, seeps, reservoirs, cattle stock tanks, anything to fill up. And elk don't necessarily have the whitetail like home territory. They do set up camps in areas and will stay there. But once hunting season comes along, unless you're in a real unique area where there's just not much hunting pressure, they get bumped around. So that home territory just kind of goes out the window, and they're looking for places where they're not feeling the pressure. So you might find them in a pattern. And I tend to find elk more in a pattern, say in mid-October and beyond. Once those bachelor bulls leave the herds, they get into a feeding pattern and a security pattern and a refuge pattern. And I do kill elk in patterns there. But during the rut, when things are just kind of, just flying all over the board, there's hunters going on, there's cow elk coming into estrus. The elk want to get to different security areas. It's really hard to pattern them. In all the years, the last couple decades, I had one bull that I patterned. He stayed on pattern for 8 days. It took, and I killed him in 8 days. It took me that many days, but I photographed him on opening night. He come out on the opening. I took a picture of him, and 8 days later, I was able to get an arrow in him. Same basin. Nobody was hardly hunting it except me. So it can happen. Don't bet on it. And they, like I said, they will gather their harems up, their harem of cows this time of year. That's what they're doing. They're just about ready to go into that pattern, start thinking about putting a harem together, and they'll leave and move on to another area and keep moving if pressure prompts them.
It's
So
amazing
go
how
ahead.
it's amazing how many miles they can cover so quickly in those mountains.
And you don't always get to see that, but in the prairie, I have seen it. You can literally watch them in some of these open units where elk are starting to thrive. I mean, they're out in the sagebrush now, and you can see them cover 2, 3 miles in the blink of an eye. I mean, just they keep going, and they're biologically they're called long-legged cursors. And there's a whole thing I could go into there, but they've got long legs and they curse. They really know how to jog well. And so they can just keep going and going. Where pronghorn and whitetails, they sprint to get the heck out of the way. Elk will sprint, but then it's just, hey, I'm going to go on that Boston Marathon and I won't see you ever again.
Ain't that the truth? They can move. They can move. Let me go on to the next slide for you. Ready to get into it?
I'm ready. I haven't even had caffeine yet, and I feel like I'm too jacked up. All right. So you got a plan to elk hunt, and this is a little bit out of the bounds of e-scouting, but I want people to understand how difficult it is these days to acquire an elk tag, and it's about as difficult to get the tag as it is to shoot an elk on public lands. And if you want a really bad news, the overall average when you throw in all the archery muzzleloader rifle tags, success on public lands is about 20% or less. It's not a high percentage. So you really got to do the scouting and you really got to want it. I always tell people it's a mental game. You just really got to want it. So I'm sure you ran into that, especially after you got your bull last year, trying to get it out. You really got to want it, trying to get it out of there just as
You
much as
do.
killing it.
You
So
might question it a little bit, but yeah, you really got to want to get it out of there.
So, so over the counter tags, Colorado is starting to wash those away right now. That was about the last place you could actually hope to get one. You really need to plan. And what I try to do is to look at a hunting season. And first of all, pick a state, look at the hunting season, and then narrow it down to the unit along with the weapon you want to use, and then start picking that. That's where I want to focus on and do that in a number of states. Now
Yeah.
you're going to have to look at hunter success, drawing success as you break down your units, but try to figure out 3, 4, 5 states, I would say minimum, and start applying in those states. If you just choose one, you're going to really be sucking at drawing those tags. You might get into some units where you're going to draw one every year, every other year, probably every other year nowadays, and but those tend to be hard units to hunt where the game and fish throws out a whole bunch of tags, hoping people will grab them up and try to get their kill objective in, which hardly ever works because the elk do not stand there in a shooting gallery. They just take off. So that's why I say get 4, 5, 6 different states and start applying. And make sure your kids, the minute they can start applying or buying preference points, get them in that game because you don't want them to end up like me, an old guy with no hair, trying to start into this elk game. They want, if you start buying preference points when they're 30, 40 years old, they're going to be into some of the best elk hunting ever. They're going to be able to hunt Utah, Nevada, New Mexico. Well, not New Mexico. That's a random draw across the board, but some good units in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. So get that game going with those kids. All right. As I said, planning now gives you a chance to hunt those elk every other year and maybe premium units every 10 years. Now, I just drew Arizona last year and it took me 18 years, but I
Wow.
was going for one of the higher units. I could have backed down into a different unit and probably drawn that in a dozen, 10 to 12 uh, years of preference and had a pretty good tag. But by waiting it out, I had elk hunting in my backyard, so it wasn't like I was just dying to get into another elk hunt. I got into a pretty good unit after 18 years. So, and then you might want to consider a cow hunt. And the reason you would want to consider a cow hunt is not only A, the meat is great, but B, you're going to be able to draw that tag easier. And then C, you can learn the unit and start to study the unit while you're hunting, while you're putting some meat in the freezer. And my family lives on elk meat. It's the best stuff there is. I mean, just hands down, it's great meat. So a cow eats like a bull eats like a cow. It's all good. And
Mm-hmm.
finally, your budget. You need to budget, keep a little bit of a slush fund. Like Dave Ramsey always says, an emergency, keep your emergency fund there for 6 months worth of house payments and all that stuff. So elk hunting is expensive. The tags are going to be expensive, applying every year. Some of the states make you buy a license just to apply. And then of course, if you'd ever get one, you're shelling out $1,000 or more, probably just in the tag alone. And then you're going to start the process of, do I do a DIY? Do I hire an outfitter? Do I do a drop camp? All those type of things. But you probably want a little slush fund sitting around, excuse me, of $4,000 or $5,000 or more or less, depending again on your goals and objectives. So.
Yeah, and to kind of come back to your second point there, with OTC being gone, a lot of folks have seen that Colorado has made the decision to kind of get rid of the unlimited non-resident OTC tags. So that was kind of a hit to a lot of people that maybe go out there every year. So what I've kind of been doing myself is like what you've talked about, past 5, 6 years is really building up points so I can kind of like what you're talking about, be able to kind of circulate, use points to get, maybe not necessarily a primo unit, but a good unit to kind of just rotate state by state, maybe every year, every other year.
And if you're busy, I would recommend too. I use Worldwide Trophy Adventures as a consultant on probably half of my elk hunting applications and stuff. So they kind of handle choosing a good unit for me,
Hmm.
uh, preference points in half the states, and then I handle the rest where I actually, have a better hands-on, boots on the ground feel for it. So that's an option too. And I know time is money, money's time, money short, all those things. But the time is money thing is key. You start sitting down, typing away, and doing an application. Oh my gosh! I mean, it's just mind-boggling these days. All the things they got make you fill out, trying to micromanage these units, and so it could be worth it to some people if they're busy with career and family, have just a touch of expendable income, hire a company to do that for you.
Absolutely. Well, let's get into the before you e-scout.
All right, got to be honest with yourself. Do you want to go DIY everything yourself or go outfitted? And if you're only going to do a few hunts in your lifetime, there's nothing against going with a good vetted outfitter. They just do everything for you. They paid a lease maybe, to get you on some private land. They maybe have back access into public land that no one else can get into. There's there's a lot of benefits of that. Uh, you could even do a drop camp. And if you do DIY, just remember, do it yourself is just that. You do everything. You set up the camp, you scout, you set up the camp, you do the hunt. If you're lucky, you kill, you're responsible for an 800-pound animal, taking that animal and then proportioning it into backpack sized chunks. And then you're dealing with 4 pack loads of meat typically, and then the head if you shot a bull. So it's you do everything on that. So are you in shape to do that? Are you mentally tough enough to do that? And just here's a quick number I throw out to a lot of people. On my DIY hunts, whether it's rifle or bow, I tend to spend 8 to 15 days per hunt killing an animal. So it's not the 5 days. People say, "Oh, I'll take 5 days of vacation. I'll use the weekends, a Sunday to travel, whatever, Saturday and a Sunday to travel home." That might do it in a good unit, but in most areas, especially archery, but even on rifle, like I said, it's typically 8 to 15 day, 2 weeks, one solid long week, more than likely into the second week. So
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely understand what you're saying there because I feel like I've been on quite a few hunts where I've gotten to that fifth or sixth day trying to fit that in, like what you're talking about. And you get to like that fifth or sixth day and you just feel like you're really starting to figure things out, but then you got to pack up and go home.
yeah, you're just getting it dialed in, and you're probably going to move, and we're going to get into that e-scouting. But so, you get into one spot, there's elk, and then 2 days later, they're nothing. It's as quiet as,
Yeah.
as a church when everybody's praying. And then you move, and all of a sudden you're into elk again. Well, then it's day 5 or 6. And so start learning your unit. You really need to know your unit when you apply for one. And then you just got to know everything about it. And you can just start right off the bat snooping online and forums. You can go on all kinds of forums, Rockslide or whatever, and just say, hey, anybody know anything about unit 22 in Wyoming or whatever?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of people out there that'll answer you. Yeah, we hunted there, and a lot of hunting pressure, or we hunted there and there was a lot of elk, but they were on private land. So do that. And then the other people I tend to really like to talk to, game and fish people.
Yes.
But I'll be honest, I like game wardens even better than biologists.
Yes.
Because game wardens, in my opinion, they're in the field, they're dealing with hunters, they're dealing with ranchers who are having elk problems, and so they know the dynamics of the herd and what's going on. They know the hunting pressure. They're driving around that unit. They see where all the camps are and everything. They understand. Going back to the landowners, if those elk are not staying on public land, or going back and forth between public and private, they absolutely know that, because they just get inundated with calls from landowners griping about, I've got 400 elk on my hay field and they're eating all my hay bales. What are you going to do about it? Well, we could let some hunters on there. I can't let hunters on, but the game warden will say, he'll tell you, there's a lot of elk in this area, and they shift down to here. Man, that information like that's golden if you can get that type of stuff. And like I said, the biologists know the numbers.
Hmm.
Some of them know the exact same stuff as the game wardens, but it just seems like the game wardens, they just deal with the crap day in and day out. And they want elk killed. What it was, it hurt them telling you something. Their whole job is to get some elk killed and keep people happy. So and then going back to that, in this day and age, I just read about it in our Wyoming News again 2 days ago. You've got to understand what those elk are doing in that unit. And are they staying in the unit? Are they staying on public lands, or are they making mad dashes to private refuges? And I'll just be honest with you, the majority of elk I'm hunting anymore, they're not hardcore staying in the unit on public lands. They go back and forth between private, and some of them load up on private so big that
Yeah.
it almost empties the unit, and you can't hardly it's just hard hunting on the public. And that's one thing I tell people when you're looking at units. uh, and this here, get your pen and paper out, folks. This is really important. When you're looking at units, good units have high numbers of elk and low numbers of private land. And what that does is it doesn't allow those elk to run to private land. Um, it makes them stay in the unit. My best rifle elk hunting unit has some small parcels of public land, but for the majority of it, or small parcels of private land, excuse me, the majority of it's public, and the elk have nowhere to go. They can't run to get to refuge, and so they stay in the unit for the most part. Sometimes, all the times, I guess, they stay in the crappiest parts of the unit, but that's another story we're going to get into here in a minute. And then if you have friends, uh, hunting peers, family members in these areas, confirm everything you're finding. Start with them, whatever, but just bounce it off as many people as you can to make sure what you're reading online, what the game warden's telling you, what your cousin Eddie's telling you, all kind of synergizes and has the same message.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because those forums can kind of be misleading sometimes. You might have guys that hop on there and give you some bad information. So you got to be
And don't
careful.
want you in the unit, yeah.
Yeah. They may not want you there. So good note. I feel like a lot of times too, some of those guys will, if they're real genuine and actually wanting to help you out, they will message you on the side to have, either exchange phone numbers, have conversations, and, help you have a better experience too.
And here's another thing I tell people a lot, and I do this with some of my other friends, is don't be afraid to say, hey, I'll swap you a week of whitetail hunting in Ohio, if you help me in unit, 15, wherever, on elk, I'm more than willing to do that. And that's, again, what you just said. That's where you get on that private message, and things might happen there. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get into the nitty gritty of the e-scouting.
so when you have your unit, maybe you have a tag, maybe it's going to come in a year or two. The things I try to look for, again, are the basics of life for elk. The Several of them are the three are refuge security, that's one, grazing or food, that's two, and water, that's three. So you need to tear that apart. And a game warden or a biologist can be helpful, again, to help you understand where these elk, A, are hiding, and B, where they're feeding at. Of course, they're going to be drinking water at any creek, spring, little mountain lake, reservoir that they can find. Or, as I said, maybe a little bit more out in the open country, they're going to be at cattle tanks. I check cattle tanks a lot. And I actually, one of my bulls hanging right up here came from he was drinking out of a water tank. He actually jumped in the steel tank and was wallowing in there when I decided to let some air out of him. But so when you pull up your unit, as in this picture right here, what you're seeing here is, to the top half of it is good escape cover. And that includes some north facing slopes. And north facing slopes, you look for those. Elk can bed anywhere, north, south, east, west, wherever there's good canopy. But it tends to be a little cooler, especially in September, on a north facing slope. And the timber is almost always heavier on a north facing slope than it is on any other slope. So that's why you should always, again, look for good cover next to good grazing and find water in the area. So again, you got the canopy cover, the upper 2/3 of this picture. Down below, you have the grazing, and up above, there's another meadow grazing. And if you look up in the upper central to the upper left, there's a creek bottom in there too. Not to mention the lakes down in the lower corner, but all this here comes together, in my opinion, as a really good area to start. If you're in a unit, just, hey, I'm green scouting it. I find in north facing slopes, big openings or medium sized openings for grazing, and water. And the reason I say talk to a biologist and stuff too on the grazing part is, in and Will knows this as well, and if you've hunted Colorado, those elk can graze in that scrub oak and get enough grazing there. They don't need big openings, and they can graze in aspen stands. Aspen stands are actually notorious for allowing enough light down and having tall, thick grass for
Yeah.
grazing. So you have to have, I mean, this here picture right here shows classic Rocky Mountain country with the grazing and the openings. But say you pull up a picture on your HuntStand, your e-scouting in your unit, and it's just all canopy and no openings, nothing. That area may hold elk, but I would say that's a pass-through area. Those elk aren't going to stay there because they can't live on pine needles. They need something to eat. They may pass through there. They may be dropping 3,000 feet or whatever to get to grass. And I hunt elk regularly that drop 2,000 feet all the time to get to grazing. So don't ever, just like they'll travel long distances, they go up and down mountains just like you'd go up an escalator in a department store. So
How I'm trying when it comes to how far these elk will travel in a day, the elk hunt I went on this past year, they were making probably a 2 to 3 mile loop every day, we found out. Um, is that pretty typical for what you see when elk kind of get in patterns during certain times of year? Because I felt like one of the things I struggled with growing up a whitetail hunter and then going out to Colorado was I grew up with this mindset that, deer travel very short distances where I hunt, whereas it's completely different with elk. I mean, we're talking miles a day, wouldn't you say?
I'd say that's actually pretty common, a 2 to 3 mile loop. And I do see circular patterns where they're, especially in a little bit more open country, where they're going from water hole to water hole to water hole to water hole back the other one. So they're spending a day in this area, they're going to another area, spending a day in another area, and they're doing like a 3 or 4 day circuit.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in the mountains, they may do that too. It seems like more in the mountains, although anywhere, they're getting, when they get pressure, they just go. And that's why I say they may hit a canopy area and hang out there for a day, but if there's no food there, they're gone. They're boogieing. They need a lot of they need up to 20 pounds of grass a day. So when you throw in one big bull, a satellite or two, and then a dozen cows, that adds up to a lot of grass. That's why I say when the bulls break into bachelor groups, a little later in the season, one of my little hot spots is maybe 6, 7 acres in size grazing. It's a vertical slope, and they come through there. Just a handful of bulls. That's their little spot, and they don't stay there all the time. It's again, so like a pass through circuit. But if I lay there for 3 or 4 days straight when there's snow on the ground, I can almost guarantee a bull's going to walk through there. It's not very big again, it's only a few acres, handful of acres, but it's what they need at that given time, that given day. And then in that time of year, they're eating snow. And remember that too. Elk will go from water to snow at the drop of a hat. They do not need drinkable water. And I see that all the time shed antler hunting, where when it's greening up, those elk will drop out of the snow cover, drop down the mountain 1,000, 2,000 feet, graze on those little first shoots of green grass that are coming up at the warmer, lower elevation, and then they shoot right back up, and they're getting their moisture from the snow when they get back to the higher elevation.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Well, I think you spoke on it just a second ago, was when these elk get pressure, they tend to move. So I think one of the things you have on here is, looking for those roadless areas to maybe find those elk that get pressure.
So this here is just, again, another example, but you can see on there, I've measured the distance. There's no roads in this picture. So it's 2.5 miles from using the measuring tool on HuntStand from icon to icon, from the marker to marker. Going up and down, it's probably 2 miles, just maybe a little bit under. There's not a road in there. That's kind of the minimum I like to see for an area. Now, a lot of that depends too. Is it real vertical, steep? Because that cancels out a lot of people right away. The area might not have to be quite as big as that.
Mm-hmm.
But just a few quick figures. 70 to 73% of Americans are overweight or obese. So you just got rid of that group right there. They're not going past a mile from the
Yeah.
trailhead for the most part. Then you've got to deal with that other 25%. Well, 25% of those, half of that number, I'm not really great at math. So say 12, 13% of that are just in fair shape, and they don't have the mental push and drive. You're dealing with maybe 10 to 11% of the hunters that are going to push further than a mile, 2 miles in, say, let's give them that much. They're going to go 2 miles in, and or go up in elevation over 1,000 feet ascent, or down, because then, either way, you got to come back up. So look for those things. Look for a big block of country measured out using your measuring tool on HuntStand, looking over your unit. Look for a block of country that's couple square miles, 3 square. I mean, the bigger the better. That has no roads in it. Or I always keep my fingers crossed. It has a road system, but the Forest Service or BLM has shut the roads down. So there's
Yep.
no travel in there. Those roads are great for just hauling butt down them in the dark of the morning, trying to get back in there, or using your mountain bike. One of the areas I'm hunting this coming up here in a few weeks, gets shut down to motorized vehicles partway through the season. And I've been riding my mountain bike now every day as part of my workout routine, just to make sure once that happens, they still got access into there. So vertical distance, steep, up or down, 1,000 feet generally, is going to keep the most guys out of there, or they do it one time and then long hikes, a couple miles in minimum.
Yeah, I mean those elk, man, they just love that steep and nasty stuff. I mean, last year the elk that we got into, you could see them from the road, and we were actually near a turnaround where the road was shut down. So a lot of people weren't seeing these elk going in. You could see them from the road, but I mean they were 12 to 1500 yards off the road. And then when you're driving out, I mean you're obviously not seeing them, but I mean I'd be willing to bet probably, that number that you're talking about, 70 to 80% of people, they probably looked at those elk that we went after and they're like, nah, we'll come back the next day and see if they're closer. But that wasn't the case because they just kept getting pressure and moving further and further back, getting away from that road. And I mean, luckily we got on them, but it's something to think about for sure.
Elk hunting is not an out of shape person's game.
No.
Public land elk hunting is not.
I will,
Right.
Mark, I'll tell you, man, I did college track and I went through a lot of hard workouts and did a lot of that stuff growing up. But I will tell you, when you have a foot and a half of snow on the ground and you're trying to haul out um, a bull's full cape, head, and antlers on your back,
That's an incredible load in itself.
yeah, I will hands down say that is one of the hardest, if not the hardest physically challenging thing I've done in my life.
No, I've been there, done that. That's why I was telling you this bull right here. That's the last bull I mounted, and I did that whole bull by myself, solo. Start to finish, pack not only hunting but packing him out, and
Dude.
from now on they just come out in skulls.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you really start to contemplate that after that first one, you're like, wonder. It makes it a lot easier. That's for dang sure. Let's move on. So we're talking food, water, and bedding cover. How to identify those?
So we kind of looked at or discussed some of this here, but some of your contour overlays that you can use on HuntStand really will help you as far as giving you the not only the degree of grade,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and maybe it's too steep. So you really got to look at those lines, the contour lines, but it will also show you where the drainages are. So how does that north face slope with a drainage below or behind it? And again, like I said, lots of times I run into elk right on the very top of a ridge. They get up on top, kind of flattens out, and they bed there. They don't drop into the north face. But it's all about hunting pressure. What
Yeah.
are those elk feeling like they got to dive further and further into that cave of cover, or can they just stay up on top where there's a breeze? They can see maybe a little bit better and stuff. But definitely start to use those contour overlays. And what you see, so that's on the picture on the left. Let's go over to the one on the right. And on that one, you can see that there's bedding cover up above in that steep stuff. Yep, there you go. And that looks, I mean, that could be right on the cusp, north or south face. I probably should have thrown some contour lines on that. But if you look below, those elk are going to be up in that thicker, higher stuff. You look below and there's begins to be openings. And then you see creeks coursing through. Now, those openings alone provide good grazing, but those creeks, the creek edges also have really good lush grazing in most instances. Again, not all, but in most instances. So you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 different grazing opportunities. You got a couple of water sources through there. And even though you can't just focus on, a single pond, they're going to be in that valley at some time coming down there to get a drink. And then those elk will reverse course and go right back up into that steep cover, either in the morning or coming down in the afternoon.
I was just about to ask. That was my next question for you was where, how do you typically see them traveling? Like, are most of them hitting that water, that grazing early morning and going back up to bed before midday or, yeah.
Elk will get out of their beds And if it's super hot in the afternoon, so let's start in the afternoon. If it's hot and warm, 70s, 80s, 90s, which is not uncommon during archery elk season,
Yeah.
unless you're hunting 12,000 foot in elevation. But if you're hunting, 6,000 to 9,000 feet, expect warmer temperatures. And they'll get out of their beds. And a lot of times they like to go straight to water or move towards water.
Mm-hmm.
Then they'll fill up, the bull wallow a little bit, and then they're on to grazing. Then they'll graze off and on during the night. And then at sunrise, and they'll bed. I mean, they'll just go out in these openings in the dark. They'll eat, they bed, they chew their cud, they're processing the food. Then they try to replenish that at just before daybreak, and then they try to hit water again. And sometimes they're hitting that water in a seep on their way back up the mountain. But they like to fill up before they go to bed because they've eaten all that food again, and it's going to be hot all day. So now we're talking hunting strategy, but my strategy is to find where they're bedding in the afternoon by being with them in the morning, and then camping with them and hope that something happens that I can sneak in. They start bugling, chasing, and I can get in and get an arrow into one. Or, if there's a rifle season open, we're talking rut now, which is, again,
Yeah.
the strategies change. But in the mornings, I like to, where that bedding cover is on the right picture, instead of starting with those elk down in the bottom in the grassy areas,
Mm-hmm.
if possible, I like to start above them, because it's hard for especially a short-legged guy like me to keep up with elk. Once they go into movement mode at daybreak, it's really hard to catch up with them.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm up where I kind of have theorized, maybe scouted, did all that, where I think they're going to bed, or that's the zone they're going to want to get to, if I'm there, I'm waiting for them. And I may have had to use the same amount of calories, but I'm there waiting for them to come up, and I can hear them bugling, because when the elk move, they typically bugle. When they're on the move, when they stand up from their bed, they bugle in the afternoon. When they're on the move in the morning, there's bugling on and off until they kind of settle down again. I want to be where they want to be at an hour or so after sunrise, because then they get into that area, and then they kind of filter around, chase each other around, trying to find a bed. And that's when I'm sneaking into call or sneaking into still hunt or whatever.
Yeah. No, it's a good note. Good little golden nugget there that I hope a lot of y'all picked up on, because I just did it. I just learned that, so I like it. On to the next one, Mark.
Yes, sir. So you can just there's so many layers on HuntStand Pro Whitetail, but what I usually do is start out with the hybrid map, and then I throw over the top of it property ownership. So what you're seeing here is private land, state land, and yeah, private. Yeah, that's private,
Mm-hmm.
state, and then on the left it doesn't have it designated, but that's Forest Service.
Okay.
So those elk on this here that I pulled up, I just pulled this out of the blue. I don't even hunt this area, but it's a real easy example of what I do a lot. Those elk a lot of times are going to want to go to that private land and hang out there. But what you find is, so much of the private lands in the foothills, a lot of times, those elk still go back and forth up into the canopy to bed, up into the higher ground, because it's cooler, it's got better cover. And if there's no road back access on the left side of the frames, or hard access, they don't feel the pressure. So they'll go down on the private, maybe hang on the private, but you still get a flow back and forth of elk onto the public. And you get uh stragglers coming in all the time, satellite bulls, ones and twos, maybe a small band of cows. They can smell like you can't believe, and follow the trail to where all the elk are. And they love to ball up
Mm-hmm.
in certain areas. I mean, I've been in a lot of these places looking into private ground. There will be 400 head of elk, and I'm like, what the heck? But those same 400, there's always some squirting out and some coming in, and that's what you got to hope for. At least in this example right here, property ownership is huge. The property information overlay on HuntStand, that's a huge thing in this day and age where elk do not stay on public all the time.
Mhm. When it comes to a situation like this, where let's say we got somebody out there, they're looking at this map right now. Going back to what you talked about earlier about, the elk will bed in kind of those meadows and feed all night. They'll hit that water real quick before going back up. Do you see a lot of times these elk will hang out kind of in that private in similar fashion how they do with those meadows, that they'll hang out there all night, grab some water, and then they may come up to that public in bed till before going back down in the evening? Or how have you typically seen that in a scenario like this?
I've seen it every which way. What I always hope for is that private land has an outfitter on it and has leased it. And
Mm,
so he's putting a little pressure on, they're nudging them. And when I see that, believe that's the case, then I have a lot higher confidence that those elk are going to go back up onto the public. I killed one of my biggest bulls, archery, that very scenario. The bull he was going right down to a highway in the dark of the night on an irrigated alfalfa field and feeding. But he would come back up because it was highway and there was just a narrow strip of private. But he'd come up with his herd up into the public, and he did that just one day too many. So, so they do bounce around, and
yeah.
then if there's pressure below them, then they'll get pushed back up a little bit onto that border line. The big thing about hunting borders, and this again is kind of off tangent, but especially bow and arrow, boy, give yourself plenty of leeway if you get an arrow into a bull, because the landowner situation is just changing across the West. It used to be you could knock on doors. Then it was like, well, yeah, maybe you can cross my land to get to the public and hunt.
Mhm.
Now you shoot a big bull, and bulls are big, and an arrow in them, they don't always die right away if it's not perfect. And it gets back on there. I know two or three cases last year alone where the landowners basically told the hunters to, I'm not letting you on. And in Wyoming, the one it was publicized on some of the news here, the game warden come in, they don't have to let him in. And the game warden asked the landowner, can he go recover his bull? It was laying right out in an open field. And that guy said, no, I'm going to let it rot there. And he did. That bull just laid out in the field. And then my uh, nephew had the same situation in Montana. It hit a bull and didn't get a great hit on it, but it got into some private land. Guy that is an absentee landowner out of southeast state, I won't even name, but it wouldn't let him on to go see if he could recover it. So
Man,
give yourself plenty of room if you're hunting those boundaries. I think you have nowadays. That's got to be in your plan. You got to be thinking that could be part of my plan. I got to be hunting close to some of these private land holdings, but
man, crazy, crazy. Let's move on to right here. What we got? 3D maps.
let's go to a positive note. All right. 3D maps. They give you flyover capabilities, and you can just fly, just like you're had a drone, you're in an airplane or whatever. This one here is a good example showing uh, you probably saw the topographical lines here through the contour overlay on your HuntStand app, but instead of just relying on that, and you probably can't have boots on the ground, pull up the 3D map and fly it. And then all of a sudden you're just like, holy cow, there's a lot of steepness in there, maybe that I wasn't quite thinking right on. And I think this is later in there, but I'll just throw it out now. As good as HuntStand is and Google Earth and all these things, they can still be deceiving in the steepness factor, because uh, you might not be able to see all the scree on a slope, small rocks. Again, it might just be too steep. It might be full of downfall or deadfall that's fallen, dead timber that's fallen down under the canopy that you can't see. So do as much as you can. The 3D map's a good start. to kind of get a feel for where you're going to be walking later.
Yeah.
It's pretty, you can get pretty good information, get a pretty good feel for it, but you just never know.
Well, I mean, it's super key. I mean, you touched on it earlier. I mean, with your fitness level, I mean, you can do all this great e-scouting and drop pins, but getting into this 3D layer will give you a really good idea of what you're about to get yourself into and how many ruck walks you need to start doing.
And the monthly satellite, especially what's going on now across the West with fires, if you're not keeping up on your unit and following the news, say you're not following that great unit, you just landed in Utah. I just talked to a guy Saturday, had a bighorn sheep tag in Wyoming. His unit's on fire, at least the area he wanted to come in. That monthly satellite can help you out as well. Look at pictures. Has there been a recent fire? Was there a fire last year in there and you just didn't know, things like that. In this day and age, you really have to keep up on, or you're going to drive out there from Ohio or Pennsylvania and end up, on a trail and winding up, and it's like, oh my gosh, this whole thing burned over the summer. So keep up on that type of thing too, and that monthly satellite can definitely help you there. High ground, always take the high ground, whether you're in a war with the enemy or war with elk. So I like to get up high as much as I can. And of course, the several different contour overlays that HuntStand offers shows you those high points, those high ridges. Now out west, you can find a lot of high points, but what's the problem? Trees. So you got to find those high areas. And in the upper left here, you see the big basin going up, 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 up. It's open. At the top of that basin, that's probably where I'd set up to do a lot of glassing, because I can glass down and I can glass across there, and I've got openings. So, and you can do the same thing if you go from that basin down a little bit lower left. Same thing, the contour lines are going up. There's some openings there. Get to that point. Maybe you can come in from behind. There's a ATV trail or something there. But again, it gives you a good glassing down and across the basin to see what's going on. If you look on the right-hand side of this, there's a lot of high points there, several mountaintops and everything. Too much for the most part, timber cover, except for a couple of those small openings where that does, to me, it just looks like it wouldn't hardly be worth going to glass. It'd be maybe worth going to hunt, but it's definitely not a glassing spot.
Mhm. I like it. And then in addition to kind of looking for these glassing spots, talk about how you like to use Hunt Zone to give you an idea of what the wind is doing. Now, obviously, it could do a bunch of different things going down drainages, around points and everything. But how do you use Hunt Zone to kind of help you hone in on an area?
Well, it's just a good starting tool. It to give you that, is the wind, is there pressure gradient changes? Is the wind going to be strong north? Is it going to be strong south? Because even if you've got all this terrain, and sometimes you just don't know what's going to happen when you get down there as far as the wind. But at least you have that starting point, and you know that anytime you get up on a level bench down in a valley basin at the bottom, it's a pretty big broad valley, or a creek flowing where you know that the creek's going north south, you got a north wind, you know exactly what the wind's going to do in there. It's a good starting point. After that, just always keep in mind, and it's written right there, but elk move into the wind. They live or die by the wind. They got great eyes, good hearing, maybe above average hearing, maybe a little better than a whitetail, but they got a nose like no other, and they use it constantly as they move through the woods. It's always wind in their face and thermals, uh, which Hunt Zone cannot detect necessarily. But always remember that if you're on a mountain slope in the mornings, cold air is descending. At mid-morning, early, right before noon, it's starting to go up with heating of the day. And then late in the day, it'll cool again and start descending. So you have to keep that in mind as you're chasing after elk. Monitor your watch, know that, okay, it's a strong north wind. So at say high noon, when you reach top of that mountain, it's going to be a north wind. But in between, you're dealing with thermals. And
Yeah.
then, of course, we drop into little side draws and such in the canyons. Man, you're just gonna have to use your puffer bottle and figure out that this is what the wind's doing, because there's just too many terrain folds in some of that country to rely on what Hunt Zone's going to do. Use it as your starting point. Look at your forecast. See how the wind's going to change over the course of the day. Start running.
Absolutely. Good nuggets there. Let's get into I think we got elk camp. Let's get into elk camp to kind of talk about that, man.
So elk camp is important. And you need to use your natural atlas to start with if you're going to use a campground. They're right on there. You can start pointing them out, marking them here. Maybe I should look at this one, this one, this one, this one. And then if you decide that that's where you want to go, always have backups, 2 or 3 of those National Forest Service campgrounds, because they get busy during hunting season. It's just people like to, it's just like when I go hiking with my wife, she likes to go hiking on the marked trails. And I always just take off on the unmarked and we go wherever we want. So many
Yeah.
people want to camp in a campground that's got a picnic table, a little spot to back into, that type of thing.
Mm.
Personally, I like to look for primitive camping, uh, camping that you just pull off the trail. Most forests, national forests, you can pull off 300 feet, I believe, somewhere there. Don't quote me on that. I don't want you to get a ticket, but you can be 300 feet off a trail, and the BLM, Bureau of Land Management ground, is about the same. So look for a flat spot. But again, when you get up on those winding mountain trails, you need 2, 3, or 4 backup places, because someone probably has already taken up 1 or 2 of those spots. And if you're going up there in your trailer, then all of a sudden you get to the one you want, but you can't back up, and there's already a huge camp there, you're screwed. A lot of times what I do is I'll drive so far where I have a turnaround with my trailer. I use my horse trailer as my main camp, and then I back the ATV out of it, and I drive up the road and check on the ATV, dump it out of the horse trailer and blow up the road as fast as I can to see if there's openings. But back up, back up on your campsites. And then you're going to want to check and see if the roads are good in wet weather, and do you need an ATV? Now, the game warden, your friends, they can tell you that stuff too. Is that a muddy road? Is it going to have snow in September? If you're going on an archery hunt, which is not uncommon, especially the higher you get. And as you're doing the research, are you even going to need a camp? Maybe you're just going to be parked at a trailhead and you're going to be backpacking or bivvy hunting. So again, that's a consideration. And even in a backpack hunt, I would still have a couple of places set up, ready to go, at least in your unit, because you might pull into that trailhead and there's 17 cars from Wisconsin there. And it's like, gosh, I don't want to, I just don't want to deal with that. And then you go to your next one and try that. So sorry, Wisconsin guys, I just had to pick on you. I see those license plates all the time in my backyard. So,
I see lots
and
of
then,
pictures of you once.
I like to have a base camp. Even if I'm going to bivvy or backpack, I like to have a base camp. So I usually, like I said, I bring my horse trailer there. I always have a backpack ready to go for bivvying, so I can just run and gun, checking out new places, and then, but yet come back to the base camp, get a good night's sleep, wash up and everything when I can. I've been pretty successful in the last decade and a half just hunting from a pretty comfortable camp and doing ATV rides to different areas, and then
Yeah.
hiking in. And I don't know. I'm getting old. I like a nice bed. I don't like to be uncomfortable. I like to get good rest, and I've still been successful. So I set up a base camp. I do a lot of ATVing in, hiking in, and if I bivvy, I still got a base camp to come back to. Then always research uh, water, food, and fuel in case you're staying longer. You might, or driving a lot.
Mhm.
Is there a town nearby? Does the National Forest Service campground 3 miles down the road have a hand pump that you could fill up, some water jugs? and can I get to town, get fuel? So check that stuff out ahead of time, have it all marked out. And then with boots on the ground, you can do this. Otherwise, if you don't, you're going to have just to rely on what happens when you get there or friends. But confirm cellular service and different points of connectivity. I mean, I'm old school, yeah, but I still, I love checking the news, checking the weather, checking my HuntStand app. Maybe I have to reload a new map or whatever because I moved again. And be sure you download your offline on HuntStand, your maps offline, so you can get to them if there is no cell service, because odds are there won't be. So you want that map on your phone ready to go. And that connectivity sometimes it surprises you. You're up in the middle of nowhere, and here it is. This day and age, it's getting better and better practically
Yeah.
by the month, I suspect. So
Yeah. And that's where it's also always handy to have a, communication device on hand just in case as well.
I take that InReach Mini 2, the Garmin InReach Mini 2, and have that set up during hunting season. And I hunt solo the majority of the time, so
Yeah.
I can just send messages home. I'm okay, quick message. I'm okay. And then if I'd fall down and can hardly function, it's got an SOS button on the side I can send. And that's all satellite. So
Mhm.
all you need is a little bit of open sky, no cellular towers nearby.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's get into the boots on the ground segment of this bad boy.
So boots on the ground is just basically taking everything you've marked and discovered on your HuntStand hunt area map and looking at it in real life. You review your camp options. Do you have enough backup areas? Can I get a trailer in here? Can I put up a wall tent? Whatnot. Looking at the trailheads. This is where I want to jump off and confirm all your restocking needs. And say you got to go into town. Are they open at 9 at night? When that's when you would get into town. Confirm all that. Can you get the right fuel you need? Do they have diesel fuel? In some of these little towns, you might not even be able to get diesel fuel. I've noticed that from time to time. And then begin confirming all your connectivity for outside communication and SOS on your smartphone. And as we discussed, or back that up with a satellite type device, whether it's a rental satellite phone or just a small Garmin InReach Mini. And then I like to drive and evaluate all roads. I just did that a few weeks ago in Montana. Went up there, had everything figured out on my app where I wanted to look, and where guys had told me they'd seen out, blah, blah, blah. And then jumped on my ATV, found the trailheads where I get my truck the closest, marked a whole bunch of camping spots out on my HuntStand app, and then drove the trails in on my ATV to see time them, the ruggedness of them, and whether or not they were blocked because of deadfall this time of year. There's, when summer storms knocking trees down. And then I like to hike access routes in at least part of the way, if not the entire way. And again, time it, see if it's doable. Like we talked, you look at the satellite, oh, I can do that. Then you get there and it's like, what the? There's no way I can get up and down that thing. Or if
Yeah.
I kill him, this is my deal. I get to a spot and it's like, well, I can get down there and I get back out. But if I kill an elk in there, I'm really screwed. I mean, it's just going to be hard to get an elk out of there. So it's good to look at stuff firsthand if you can. I know that's not doable for everybody. And then, as we said, download those offline maps beforehand and test them in there. See if everything's working, right on your HuntStand app. Check, like, I'll put here where I'm standing in this picture right here. This is over in Western Wyoming. It's a unit my son and I were scouting, and we had pretty good cell service from right up there on top on that spot right there. And we had good visibility, so we could see any grizzlies if they were stalking us too. So
It's always something you got to keep in the back of the mind, man. Some those big
uh,
old grizzes.
and they're spreading out more and more. So
Oof. Yeah, you got to pack too. Make sure you're packing a side piece on that one.
yeah, you can see it. I got my sidearm down there right beside me. So
Well, how about your boots on the ground evaluation?
one of the things I like to find, especially if you can do it late in the summers, I like to find cow elk because cow elk are in nursery herds. They're breaking up a little bit into smaller units, but they're still pretty visible out in the open as they graze. And bulls are the same way. It's just like whitetails in late August and September on a soybean field. They're in those bachelor groups out feeding the open. Bulls do the same, cows do the same. So I like to mark all those, especially like to mark the cows because what's going to come to the cows in a few weeks, the bulls. And
Mhm.
they may transition a little bit here and there. But if you're got them marked in an area, there's a good chance those bulls and everything's going to happen pretty close to that area on opening day, that first week of September. So, and then I always like to look for signs of the rut, past and present, because you might go out there late where they're starting to rub here pretty quick here in August. But I like to find lots of clusters of rubs, old, new, old, new from last year,
Yeah.
and possibly new from this year. But when you find that cluster type information with old droppings, it gives you a pretty good confidence that that's a rutting area and the bulls are going to be in there. I do that all the time. I did it as out just the other day up here in the mountains of Wyoming when I was in, this is picture here's just from a few weeks ago in Montana when I'm spring shed hunting for antlers, constantly looking for rubs, trying to figure out areas where people might be overlooking where these rutting elk are hanging out. So and then when you're looking at droppings, if you're not finding rubs and you're finding lots of droppings, ignore them, especially if they're old. Don't ignore them if they're steamy, fresh, squishy. But if you find a lot of droppings and there's no rubs, you're probably in a winter area where the elk have just hung out in the winter and didn't do a whole, they just lived there for a few months. And then listen, cows and calves talk a lot in the late summer, that the calves are real active then. There's a lot of mewing going back and forth and bulls are bugling already. I talked to one of my good friends in Colorado just yesterday or the day before, and he was telling me how they were hearing bugles already. Not screaming bugles, but just satellite bulls communicating, showing some dominance. And an elk will bugle year round. It's just it slows down, in the winter and
Yeah.
spring, starts peaking back up into the summer and fall. But so listen, and don't be afraid to use get your locator bugle out right away at dawn or dusk and do a bugle. But I wouldn't get too crazy and try to call one in. I just locate. Oh, he's on that side of the canyon. Drop a marker on there that's where that sound like it come from over there. Maybe go over there and see. Maybe you're going to find a spring or something that isn't showing up on your natural atlas or water, on the water sources and stuff. You might find a hidden spring. So, and then confirm bedding areas too. These benches, they'll have old beds in them. And elk paw out of bed, just like a mule deer or a whitetail will. They'll paw out of bed, try to get the pine cones out of it. They'll get any rocks out of it. They'll flip those right out. And they're trying to get to the cool dirt duff. They like that coolness
Mhm.
of the forest duff that they're up against. I see all kinds of beds when I'm out, dugout beds and stuff. And on those steep slopes, pay attention to any trees that have fallen over. They leave a divot on the top of it. And those elk, a lot of times, if it's not too rocky, will bed in those divots. One area I pulled two bulls out of a basin. That's where those elk, it was so steep they couldn't bed. They literally couldn't bed. They would just roll down the hill. But they were finding those trees and you could just see all across the whole herd would just have a tree picked out, go bed there and stay there for the day. It was the craziest thing I ever saw. So, and
Yeah.
then begin to look for wallowing in the wallows, especially the week before archery season kicks off, and look for that mud flung up on the side that looks like it just dried or is wet yet, and stirred up water. The water will be stirred up if they've just been in there. It might settle, if you're a few hours later, but especially look for how much that mud is thrown through.
All good things to mark up for whenever you get back out there to actually chase after those boogers. All right, Mark. Well, before we get to picking a prize pack giveaway winner and getting into the QA sessions, When it comes to some of the things we've talked about from planning, pre e-scouting, fine tuning your e-scouting, elk camp, boots on the ground stuff, you got any kind of like final golden nuggets you want to give all the attendees real quick?
Get in shape, and then
Yes.
stay positive, because all my friends that go with me drop out after about 3 or 4, rarely 5 days in. And part of it's they're just taxing their bodies too much, and you just got to have mental positivity. It's a mind game. If you're in shape, that helps your mind work. And
Yeah.
but DIY public land elk hunting requires you to go above and beyond, as you said it earlier too. But some of the toughest hunting you'll ever do, outside of maybe sheep hunting, which how many of us get to do that? But it's it's a game of being in shape and having a positive mental attitude. I can do this. And don't, if you run into a roadblock, move on to another location. Just keep trying to find the pattern. And eventually it happens. Like I said, it takes a while sometimes, but that's
Yeah,
it. I don't have
absolutely.
any more wisdom. I'm just tapped out.
Well, you might get to share some here in the Q&A session. But what we're going to do right now, we have a pretty sick prize pack from some of our partners over at Stealth Cam, Tenzig, Sog Knives, Cyclops Lighting, and Halo. And so we've got three lucky winners that I'm going to announce right now that we will email you shortly after to get some information from you. So that way we can get you your pretty awesome prize pack. And so our three winners for attending tonight and getting this, we've got that Stealth Cam revolver, which is a brand new 360 camera. We've got a pretty nice 10 zig pag. That SOG Ether FX knife, I use that a lot this past season, and I really love it. It's got a nice Kydeck holster, so you can stick it on your bino harness. Always going to have a good light, like the Cyclops Poseidon right there, and then a good rangefinder from Halo. So our three winners for tonight are Daniel Nicholson, Keith Kurtz, and on this last one, I hope I pronounce your last name correctly. We've got Tucker Graff. So congratulations and thanks for attending tonight. We will be reaching out to you to get your information so we can get you your prize pack so you can get that here pretty shortly. But right now, to end,
Congrats, everyone.
yeah, you got yourself a pretty nice prize pack there. I'm jealous. So to kind of end tonight, we've got ourselves a nice little Q&A session, and disregard the name there. Um, we've got a nice list here. That was from our pronghorn hunt class from a couple weeks.
I can let Jace do it. He's a good elk hunter. I know that.
He is. He's killed some elk himself. And in fact, I think he killed three or four last year. And so
He stacks them up.
we've got a question from Scott W. Mark, is it better to hunt elk on a dry year or a wet year?
Uh, I would say uh, it depends on the unit. If you're hunting an open country, partial pines, partial open country, I like a dry.
Mhm.
I like dry because the elk are going to very isolated, targeted water sources in that case. Think desert, think deserts of New Mexico. But I hunt eastern Montana some of the parts of Wyoming, same way. When it's dry, just like pronghorn hunting, they got to go to the water dries up and they got to go to water. So again, if it's in the mountains, even a dry year, the springs tend to run. They're going to find water. But out in an open country unit, I like dry when there's not flowing springs and creeks and everything all around.
Let's see.
I'm a whitetail hunter by trait, so I have no problem sitting in a tree stand, a ground blind, over a wallow or a water hole. I've killed I think 3 good bulls out of tree stands now. So
Speaking of wallows, got a question here. Leonard B sent in prior to the hunt class. Any tips on locating and hunting at wallows?
locating wallows is can be hard if there's a lot of water around. But one of the things I look for on maps, on HuntStand, on the Natural Atlas, is anywhere there's water flowing into, like where it starts to begin to look like the formation of a lake, or a middle of an opening where a creek comes in and all of a sudden disappears and the creek comes out again, is marshy, those marshy areas. Those elk love those. So anytime you can see any type of wetland type cover, or on maps, sometimes that, they'll show the cattail type markings on there. Those are really good places to at least begin your search. And like I said, though, elk wallow anywhere. I watched one bull crawl right into a stock tank, and he wallowed right there. And I shot another nice bull. He walked right out into the middle of a reservoir, no mud, but he was wallowing, just throwing water, all, thrashing in the water, and up to his belly, and that bull's hanging right there. So so it can happen anywhere, but follow the known water sources, check those out, and then you can expand your search.
Now, you mentioned earlier, correct me if I'm wrong, you mentioned you've killed a couple of bulls from tree stands, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
We've got Paul A. asked the question, when hunting from a tree stand, what would you say is the minimum recommended height he should be setting up at?
That again, that question has so many variables, because is the tree on a steep slope? Is it on flat? Maybe the tree is even below the water source. But I would look to try to get kind of whitetail like in that 17, 18 to 20, say 17 to 22 foot.
Yeah.
Now, elk tend not to look up. They do a little bit because they're a tad scared of mountain lions, and mountain lions kill elk. You maybe not think that they're big enough, but I've seen it. I found the evidence, and I've had biologists standing right there over a dead elk showing me, yep, the mountain lion killed that elk, and he took the cape off the back, and you could see the bite marks in the neck. So, but again, most time those elk don't look up. They're coming in and they're really searching, just like a giraffe, searching around, looking before they, commit themselves to water. And they hold up a lot of times. So if you see them coming in, just sit as still as possible, obviously, and then wait for them to water. And when they put their head down, they're drinking. I don't even know if I can pull this number off the top of my head. They're probably drinking a minimum of 10 to 12, 15 quarts of water at a time. So it's going to take them a little bit to fill up. Let them settle into drinking, then draw and get shot off. So, but just think whitetail. I think you'll be okay as far as the setup.
Hmm. I do want to come back to a point, and it's due to a question we have from an attendee. Uh, Michael O asked, you had mentioned earlier in the class about when it comes to tag allocations and maybe even going on your first elk hunt, sometimes we should be a little bit more open to going after cows first instead of bulls to kind of get your feet wet. And so, the reason I'm bringing that up is Michael asked, when you're cow elk hunting, are you taking that same or different approach when hunting bulls? So, I mean, is there anything that differs between chasing after, the two different sexes?
Well, it depends on the season, obviously. Are you hunting them during the rut when they're in harems, or are you hunting them on winter range, rifle hunting when they're moving to a winter area or in transition, finishing up with the rut? So, uh, yes and no. I really think it's as hard to shoot unless you're in a shooting gallery situation. It's as hard to shoot a cow elk during archery season as it is a bull, because they're immersed in a herd with all those eyes.
Yeah.
The bulls you kill, are tending to leave the herd, getting on the outskirts and doing something stupid. uh, it's they're not all just staying together. Cows tend to stay; they move just like a swarm of swallows or starlings or whatever. They're moving together, and that means you got 24, 36, whatever set of eyeballs, going all at the same time. So the bull I killed in 2020, he they came into a basin, and it was vertical, real steep, and he stayed above me, and I had cows scattered all around here, and I could not move until he left that herd and come over on the very edge and started raking. And then I just got around the cusp of the hill just enough to get outside those cows and worked right up to him, and got it within archery range of him. So now rifle season and those cows get all together in a
Yeah.
herd of 150, they still have a lot of eyeballs, but you can shoot 200, 300, 400 yards to get one. So you just need to work the terrain and try to get to where they're going to be feeding on the mesa or coming out into a meadow or what not, and use that power of the rifle, the distance factor to get a shot. I tend to think that can be hard too if there's a lot of hunting pressure, because they just, again, they get bumped around so much. But all the units vary, so it is a hard question to answer straight up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to end it on this one right here from Mike M. And might be a little bit of an open-ended question, but I'll let you be the decider of that. What would you look for, if anything at all? What would you look for in terrain during a September archery rut hunt versus, say, a second, third season rifle hunt? Is there anything you're looking for just from a terrain perspective, Mark?
It goes back to what I said earlier. In this day and age, there's so much hunting pressure on public lands because so much of the private's been shut down. I
Mhm.
think you really need to look at find food, water, refuge, vertical and away from roads. And that's where the elk are going to start to pile into. I just see it time and time again. They like steep stuff because they know the average guy won't go there. They know
Yeah.
the average guy is not going to go several miles, to hike in, and they just tend to pool in that type of terrain. So during archery season, if there's water, food, rough stuff, good distance from a road, that's where I think you're going to find that. That's where I'd start all the time. That's where I start.
Heck yeah. Well, Mark, lots of good wisdom, lots of good golden nuggets tonight for all the attendees out there. Uh, Everyone that attended tonight, we just want to thank y'all and congrats to all the winners out there. And Mark, just one last time before we part ways tonight, you got any last minute pieces of advice, golden nuggets for everyone out there when it comes to elk hunting?
Um, if you see my white Dodge truck, just ignore it. It's probably not even me. It's probably just an illusion. No, hunt hard, man. I just cannot stress that enough, that don't get down. Here's a real quick wisdom thing I do all the time. I take a lot of times, if I'm not on elk, I take the afternoon off. I hunt back to camp. I get back to camp. If I'm not hearing a bugle by late afternoon, I just turn and start hunting my way back to camp and get there before dark or at dark and get refreshed and recharged. And I'm always in the woods, usually an hour before any of you guys are in the woods. I always try to get out ahead of everybody, not only to listen to elk, but if I park my ATV at a trailhead and someone else pulls in later and they see that there, they're like, ah. And I want them to think that because I'm already an hour ahead of them listening for bugles and in there. So hunt hard, take a day off if you need to, to refresh, go to town, to get a shower, re-energize, and get back at it.
Awesome, Mark. Man, appreciate your time tonight and thank you everyone for
Thanks,
congrats.
everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Next hunt class we're going to be having is next Tuesday. We're going to be talking elk calling with world elk calling champion Jermaine Hodge. So make sure y'all sign up for that one and we'll see you on the next one.